Welcome. Tonight, we travel back to Mississippi in 1836, where a story so brutal it was nearly erased from history still whispers through forgotten graves. Two slave sisters, bound by blood and secrecy, accused of slaughtering 42 souls in a single year. This is not folklore. This is stitched together from court records, plantation logs, and testimonies buried for nearly 2 centuries. Before we descend into this dark chapter, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on real historical evidence and countless hours of research. Make sure you subscribe, because every detail you'll hear tonight was uncovered the hard way. Mississippi in 1836 was a land built on forced labor, fear, and silence. Vast cotton plantations stretched for miles, worked from before sunrise to long after dark by enslaved people who had no legal identity of their own. Every movement was controlled, every breath monitored, and punishment was a daily reality rather than an exception. The plantation was not just a workplace, it was a closed world where violence could exist unseen and unquestioned. Life for the enslaved followed a brutal routine. Men, women, and even children were driven into the fields under the watch of overseers, armed with whips and guns. Food was scarce, medical care nearly non-existent, and exhaustion was constant. Illness spread easily, deaths were common, and when someone disappeared, it rarely raised alarm. In such conditions, human life was treated as replaceable, creating the perfect environment for cruelty to hide in plain sight. Plantation owners often lived far from the fields, either in large houses or in nearby towns, trusting overseers to maintain order by any means necessary. These overseers ruled through terror, delivering savage punishments for minor disobedience. Screams carried across the land, but no one intervened. Violence was so normalized that it blended into daily life, becoming background noise rather than a cause for concern. Women on plantations faced a unique horror. They were expected to work the same punishing hours as men while also enduring constant vulnerability to abuse. Families were torn apart without warning, sold to different owners, and forbidden from mourning openly. Bonds between sisters, brothers, and parents became acts of quiet resistance, formed in whispered conversations after dark, and sustained by shared suffering. Death on a plantation was rarely investigated. Enslaved people who died were often buried quickly, without markers or records. A sudden illness, a field accident, or exhaustion was considered explanation enough. This lack of accountability created shadows where darker acts could exist without detection, where repeated deaths could be dismissed as misfortune rather than questioned as deliberate. Fear governed every interaction. Speaking out meant torture, sale, or execution. Even witnessing violence forced silence because survival depended on obedience. Rumors circulated quietly among the enslaved, but they never reached the ears of those in power. In this climate, truth had no voice, and secrets could grow unchecked. It was within this brutal, lawless system that unimaginable crimes could unfold. A place where suffering was routine, where death carried no weight, and where silence was enforced through terror. Mississippi's plantation world of 1836 did not just allow cruelty, it nurtured it, creating the conditions that made a year of slaughter possible without immediate discovery. The two sisters were born into bondage, their earliest memories shaped by chains rather than childhood. No record preserves their birth names, only fragmented mentions in plantation inventories that listed them as property instead of people. From a young age, they learned that survival depended on obedience, silence, and an ability to endure pain without reaction. Violence was not something they witnessed occasionally. It was the language of the world they grew up in. Separated from their parents early in life, the sisters were raised among strangers who came and went through sale and death. This constant loss hardened them, teaching them that attachment was dangerous. They learned to trust only each other, forming a bond so tight it became a private world inside the chaos of the plantation. In whispered conversations after exhausting days, they shared fears, anger, and a growing sense that mercy did not exist in their reality. As they entered adolescence, their labor intensified. One was assigned to domestic work near the main house, while the other was pushed into the fields. This separation exposed them to different forms of brutality. One saw cruelty hidden behind polite smiles, the other endured open punishment under the sun. Together, these experiences gave them a complete picture of the system that controlled their lives from every angle. Punishment shaped their understanding of power. They watched overseers beat people into submission, learning that pain could command obedience instantly. Over time, fear became a tool they understood deeply. While most enslaved people tried to avoid attention, the sisters learned how authority operated and how weakness was exploited. This knowledge would later become central to their actions. Rumors among the enslaved hinted that the sisters were different. They were quiet but observant, rarely emotional, and unusually close. Some said they held grudges longer than others, remembering every injustice inflicted upon them. In a place where emotions were suppressed for survival, their controlled silence made them unsettling to those around them. Their bond slowly transformed from survival into something darker. Shared trauma turned into shared resentment, and resentment into a belief that suffering was unavoidable and transferable. If pain ruled their lives, they began to see no reason it shouldn't rule others as well. The plantation had taught them this lesson without mercy. By the time they reached adulthood, the sisters were no longer just victims of their environment. They were shaped by it. Stripped of identity, empathy, and hope, they emerged as products of a system that destroyed humanity on all sides. Their origins were not born from mystery or legend, but from a world that normalized cruelty until it became indistinguishable from daily life. The first signs that something was wrong did not appear as sudden violence, but as patterns too strange to ignore. People began falling ill one after another, often after sharing food or water in the same quarters. At first, it was dismissed as exhaustion or seasonal sickness, common occurrences on plantations where bodies were pushed beyond their limits. No one questioned it, because questioning was dangerous. Whispers spread quietly among the enslaved. Someone would complain of sharp stomach pain, dizziness, or an unexplainable weakness, and within days they would be gone. These deaths came without screams or public punishment, making them easy to overlook. Silent deaths were the least suspicious kind, in a place already surrounded by suffering. The sisters were often nearby when these incidents occurred. One was known to assist with meals or water distribution, while the other moved freely between work groups. Their presence was unremarkable on the surface, yet unsettling in hindsight. Survivors later recalled how the sisters watched closely, as if studying reactions rather than offering comfort. Overseers paid little attention. As long as productivity continued, illness among enslaved workers was an inconvenience, not a concern. Deaths were written off as weakness or divine will. This negligence allowed early acts of violence to pass without scrutiny, creating a dangerous sense of invisibility around whoever was responsible. Fear kept witnesses silent. Even those who sensed something unnatural chose survival over truth. Speaking out required proof, and proof was impossible in a world where enslaved testimony carried no value. The sisters understood this better than anyone. They operated in a system that guaranteed their actions would not be believed. The pattern slowly intensified. Deaths became more frequent, and symptoms more severe. Entire groups avoided certain food sources, but hunger often forced them back. Suspicion grew, but it remained unspoken, trapped behind terrified eyes and guarded expressions. These early signs were warnings history ignored. What began as quiet, almost invisible deaths laid the foundation for a year of relentless killing. The lack of intervention, the culture of silence, and the normalization of loss allowed the violence to grow unchecked, transforming whispers into a nightmare no one could stop in time. The methods used were calculated, quiet, and designed to blend seamlessly into plantation life. Violence did not come with screams or public punishment, but through acts that looked ordinary. Shared meals, offered drinks, routine assistance. In a place where sickness was common, death caused by unnatural means could easily be disguised as fate or weakness. Poison became the most effective tool. Substances taken from plants, household supplies, or improperly stored chemicals were mixed in small amounts, ensuring symptoms appeared slowly rather than immediately. Victims would complain of pain, nausea, or dizziness long after contact, making it impossible to trace the cause back to a single moment or person. Timing was critical. Death often occurred at night or days later, far from the original interaction. By the time someone collapsed, the sisters were nowhere nearby. This delay protected them, allowing suspicion to dissolve into confusion. On plantations where medical knowledge was nearly non-existent, no one recognized the signs of deliberate poisoning. The sisters exploited trust within enslaved communities. Hunger forced people to accept help wherever it appeared. Refusing food could mean punishment or starvation, so even fear could not override necessity. This dependence created access that could be weaponized without resistance. Some deaths were caused through exhaustion and neglect rather than direct poisoning. Victims already weakened by illness or injury were pushed beyond their limits, denied rest or care, and left to collapse. In such cases, death looked accidental, the result of harsh labor rather than intention. Clean up required nothing more than silence. Bodies were buried quickly, records were minimal, and overseers rarely asked questions. Each death vanished into the countless others that defined plantation life. Without documentation, patterns could not be proven, only suspected. These methods succeeded because they mirrored the cruelty of the system itself. Nothing about them stood out in a world where suffering was constant and life disposable. The sisters did not invent secrecy, They learned it from the plantation, mastering its invisibility until killing became indistinguishable from daily survival. The plantation owners noticed the deaths, but not in the way one might expect. Loss was measured in labor, not in lives. As long as the fields were worked and quotas met, the disappearance of enslaved people was treated as an unfortunate but acceptable cost of doing business. Grief, justice, or investigation had no place in an economy built on human suffering. Overseers reported deaths casually, often attributing them to sickness, weakness, or laziness. These explanations were rarely questioned. Owners trusted overseers to maintain order and discipline, and challenging their accounts would have meant admitting negligence. Silence protected authority, and authority protected silence. In some cases, owners actively chose not to look deeper. Acknowledging something darker would invite scrutiny from neighboring plantations or local officials, risking reputation and profit. It was easier to believe that death was natural than to face the possibility of chaos within their own operations. Denial became a form of self-preservation. There were moments when suspicion surfaced. A sudden cluster of deaths might raise concern, but these doubts were quickly dismissed. Plantation life was brutal by design, and high mortality was common. When cruelty is routine, extreme outcomes no longer feel extreme, they feel expected. The enslaved had no legal voice. Even if someone tried to speak, their words carried no weight against a white overseer or owner. Testimony from enslaved people was often forbidden or ignored entirely. This imbalance ensured that truth, even when visible, remained officially invisible. Some owners feared that public investigation could spark unrest or rebellion. Questioning deaths too closely risked exposing how fragile control truly was. Maintaining fear was more important than uncovering facts. Silence was enforced not only through neglect, but through deliberate choice. This collective indifference allowed the killings to continue. By valuing profit over human life, plantation owners became passive accomplices. Their refusal to see, question, or care created the perfect shield, one that allowed a year of death to unfold behind closed gates, unnoticed by those who had the power to stop it. Fear spread faster than any illness. Among the enslaved communities, every unexplained death sent a quiet shock through the quarters. People began watching what they ate, who they stood beside, and where they slept. Ordinary routines turned tense, filled with unspoken suspicion. No one said names out loud, but eyes lingered, and silence grew heavier with each passing week. Whispers replaced conversation. At night, after exhausting days in the fields, small groups gathered in hushed circles, sharing fragments of what they had seen. Someone would mention a strange taste in food, another would recall a sudden sickness after a shared meal. These stories never formed full accusations, only warnings wrapped in fear, passed carefully from one person to another. Trust began to erode. On plantations, survival depended on cooperation, but now even kindness felt dangerous. Offers of help were questioned, shared meals avoided when possible. This breakdown of unity weakened already fragile bonds, leaving people isolated in a place where isolation could be deadly. Many believed something evil was moving among them, something that could not be confronted directly. Some turned to prayer, others to folk remedies or charms for protection. When logic failed and authority was unreachable, Fear pushed people toward superstition. Anything felt better than helplessness. Attempts to warn overseers were rare and indirect. A sudden refusal to eat certain food or unexplained absences from work were the only signals anyone dared to give. Direct accusations were unthinkable. Speaking too clearly risked punishment worse than death, and everyone knew it. Children were watched closely, kept near adults whenever possible. Mothers slept lightly, alert to every sound. The nights felt longer, heavier, filled with imagined footsteps and real anxiety. Rest became impossible when danger felt constant and invisible. This atmosphere of fear did more than terrify, it silenced. It trapped truth inside the very people who knew something was wrong. And in that silence, violence continued to grow, feeding on dread, secrecy, and a system that left its victims with no safe way to speak. The truth began to surface not through justice, but through excess. Deaths reached a point where even the plantation's rigid acceptance of loss could no longer explain the numbers. Entire work groups were shrinking too quickly, and productivity finally began to suffer. What had been ignored as routine sickness started to look like something far more deliberate. An overseer first noticed the pattern when several strong, healthy workers collapsed within days of each other. These were not the weak or elderly, but people who had shown no signs of illness before. The timing was wrong, the similarities unsettling. For the first time, questions were asked, not out of compassion, but out of concern for labor loss. Suspicion fell unevenly and cautiously. Overseers interrogated the enslaved harshly, using threats and violence to extract answers. Most knew nothing, or knew too much to speak. Fear tightened its grip, but cracks began to form as terror collided with desperation. Someone, under extreme pressure, finally hinted at repeated deaths linked to shared food and water. The sisters were not accused immediately. Instead, restrictions were placed quietly. Certain tasks were reassigned, movements watched more closely. The plantation attempted to investigate without admitting wrongdoing, hoping the problem would resolve itself. But death did not stop. It slowed, then returned. When another cluster of deaths followed, denial collapsed. Word spread beyond the plantation, reaching neighboring owners who feared similar unrest. Outside attention forced action. What had been buried in silence was now impossible to contain. Accounts later recorded describe forced confessions extracted under brutality, though details were fragmented and unreliable. The sisters' names surfaced repeatedly, whispered by different mouths under separate interrogations. Patterns aligned. Proximity became evidence. Silence was no longer protection. The discovery did not bring relief. It brought chaos, fear, and retaliation. The truth emerged not as a revelation, but as a violent rupture, exposing not only the crimes themselves, but the system that had allowed so many deaths to pass unnoticed until it became inconvenient to ignore. By the time her beauty became legend, it had also become a curse that followed her everywhere. People no longer saw her as a person, but as a spectacle, something to be admired, desired, and controlled. Whispers spread through New Orleans that her appearance could soften cruel men and ignite dangerous obsessions. In a city already drowning in secrets, her presence stirred emotions that few could handle, turning admiration into fixation and kindness into possession. Those who encountered her often described an uneasy contradiction. Her face carried a calm, almost angelic serenity, yet her eyes reflected a quiet sadness that never faded. Some claimed that looking into them felt like staring into a story that had no ending, only suffering. This contrast made her unforgettable, and forgetting her became impossible for those who crossed her path, even briefly. As her reputation grew, so did the tension around her. Rivalries formed among those who believed they had a claim over her, and jealousy crept into places it never belonged. Friendly glances turned cold, and casual conversations became sharp with hidden threats. It was as if her very existence exposed the darkness buried inside others, pulling it to the surface without mercy. Rumors began to circulate that tragedy followed her wherever she went. Accidents, sudden illnesses, and unexplained misfortunes were whispered about in hushed tones. People started to wonder whether she was cursed or whether the curse belonged to those who tried to own her. Fear mixed with fascination, creating a dangerous aura that surrounded her name like a shadow. Despite the growing dread, she remained silent, rarely defending herself against the stories told about her. This silence only deepened the mystery. Some believed it was strength, others believed it was resignation. In truth, it was survival, an understanding that words meant little in a world where she was never allowed to define herself. As time passed, the line between myth and reality blurred completely. Her story was exaggerated, twisted, and reshaped with every retelling. Beauty became the center of the tale, overshadowing her pain and erasing her humanity. What remained was a haunting symbol, not of allure, but of how easily a life could be reduced to a legend. Even after she disappeared from public memory, the echoes of her story lingered. New Orleans, with its iron balconies and fog-filled streets, seemed to remember her when people did not. Her beauty was never the true mystery. The real horror was how it trapped her, turning admiration into a prison and ensuring that her name would be remembered, but her voice forever lost. As the years moved forward, the truth about her fate grew harder to uncover. Official records were vague, incomplete, or missing entirely, as if someone had deliberately erased the final chapter of her life. What remained were fragmented accounts, half-remembered stories passed down through generations, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. The absence of clear facts only intensified the mystery, allowing imagination to fill the gaps with fear. Some claimed she was sold away in secret, sent to a place so distant that even her name was stripped from her. Others believed she met a far more violent end, silenced because her existence had become inconvenient or dangerous. These stories conflicted with one another, yet all shared the same grim certainty. Her life did not end peacefully. The lack of closure haunted those who tried to piece together her story. There were also whispers that she attempted to escape, driven by desperation rather than hope. According to these rumors, her beauty, once a chain, became a liability in hiding. Every face she passed seemed to recognize her, forcing her back into the shadows. Whether she succeeded or failed was never confirmed, but the idea of her running through the night added another layer of tragedy to the legend. Over time, her story transformed into a warning rather than a mystery. Elders spoke of her in lowered voices, using her fate to illustrate the dangers of envy, obsession, and unchecked power. She became less of a person and more of a symbol, her name invoked to remind others of how cruelty could hide behind admiration. Yet beneath all the speculation, one truth remained constant. She was denied the chance to tell her own story. Every version of events came from outsiders, each shaped by bias, fear, or fascination. Her silence, forced upon her in life, continued long after her disappearance, making the injustice even more profound. Historians who later attempted to investigate found themselves trapped between fact and folklore. Documents contradicted oral histories, and timelines refused to align. The deeper they searched, the clearer it became that the system surrounding her had no interest in preserving her truth, only controlling the narrative that remained. In the end, the mystery of her fate became inseparable from the city itself. New Orleans absorbed her story into its haunted identity. Where the past never truly dies, her life faded into uncertainty, but the injustice endured, leaving behind a chilling reminder that some mysteries exist not because the truth is unknown, but because it was never allowed to survive.